Every dynasty has moments that nearly tear it apart from the inside. For England's Plantagenet kings, one of those moments came in the 13th century. Firestorm of a civil war fueled by a weak king, a charismatic rebel, and a kingdom pushed to its absolute limit. But at the very heart of this national crisis was a much more personal conflict. A father, a son, and an unbelievable act of defiance. In the middle of a bloody civil war, a king discovered that his greatest threat wasn't a foreign army, but his own son and heir. This is the story of Prince Edward, who, long before he became one of England's most feared kings, sided with the man trying to bring his father's kingdom crashing down. It's a tale of betrayal, ambition, and the brutal political education that forged a legend. So, how does a prince end up turning on his own dad? Well, first, you have to understand the father. King Henry III was, by most accounts, a decent guy. He was pious, he loved the arts, and he famously ordered the magnificent rebuilding of Westminster Abbey. But as a king, he was a catastrophe. His reign lasted over half a century, but it was mostly defined by weakness, terrible financial decisions, and one humiliating failure after another. Henry's father was the infamous King John. And instead of learning from his dad's mistakes, Henry seemed determined to repeat them. He burned through the kingdom's money on lavish projects and pointless foreign wars, like his failed attempts to reclaim family lands in France. One of his worst ideas was a ridiculously expensive scheme to put his younger son on the throne of Sicily, a plan his own barons knew was a complete fantasy. Now, all this might have been forgiven if he was a respected leader at home. He wasn't. Henry surrounded himself with foreign relatives and advisors, especially from his wife's home in Provence. These newcomers got titles, lands, and influence, while the English barons who had run the country for generations felt totally ignored. By 1258, after a brutal famine and yet another demand for taxes, their patience finally snapped. The kingdom wasn't just broke, it was about to explode. This is where Simon de Montfort walks onto the stage. The Earl of Leicester, de Montfort was a French noble who was also the king's brother-in-law. He was everything King Henry wasn't: decisive, wildly popular, and a brilliant military commander. For years, he had been the leading voice against the king's terrible policies. With de Montfort as their leader, the barons marched into a parliament at Oxford in 1258 and delivered a bombshell. They forced Henry to agree to a radical set of reforms called the Provisions of Oxford. These rules essentially stripped the king of his absolute power and put him under the watch of a council of 15 barons. It was a palace coup in everything but name. And here's where the story takes its most shocking turn. The king's own son, the 20-year-old Prince Edward, briefly threw his weight behind the opposition. In 1259, he stunned the court by publicly backing the Provisions of Oxford and the reform movement. Why? We can't know for sure. Maybe the young, ambitious prince was just fed up with his father's weakness and saw a stronger leader in Simon de Montfort. Edward probably figured the reforms were the only way to save his own inheritance from his father's incompetence. Whatever the reason, the message was clear. The king's own house was divided. But Edward's little flirtation with the reform movement didn't last long. He soon realized that Simon de Montfort didn't just want to reform the government. He wanted to be the government. As Henry tried to claw back his power, the country tipped into open civil war. Edward picked a side, reconciling with his father, and choosing blood over rebellion. The stage was set for a fight. On May 14, 1264, the two armies met near the town of Lewes. Prince Edward, commanding the king's right flank, was eager to prove his loyalty. He saw the badly armed London troops opposite him and led a massive cavalry charge. It was a smashing success. The Londoners broke and ran, and Edward, full of righteous fury, chased them for miles, cutting them down. But in his thirst for glory, he made a catastrophic mistake. He had completely abandoned the battlefield, leaving his father's army exposed. Simon de Montfort, a master tactician, saw his chance. He swung his forces around and crashed into the vulnerable royal army. King Henry's men were overwhelmed. By the time Prince Edward got back from his reckless chase, the battle was over. The royal army was crushed, and both he and his father were taken prisoner. The prince's hot-headed mistake had just lost his father the entire kingdom. De Montfort was now, for all intents and purposes, the uncrowned king of England. For almost a year, Prince Edward was a hostage, a political pawn that de Montfort used to control the kingdom. It was deeply humiliating. It was paraded around the country as a living symbol of de Montfort's total victory. But while he was a captive, the prince was learning, watching, hardening. The rash young man who lost the Battle of Lewes was being forged into something far more dangerous. In May 1265, his moment arrived. While under guard near Hereford, he made a brilliant move. He suggested to his captors that they race their horses against his to see which was fastest. After they had worn out all of their own horses, Edward hopped on a fresh, speedy mount that had been secretly prepared for him and simply galloped away, leaving his exhausted guards in the dust. He was free, and he didn't waste a second. Edward immediately joined forces with nobles who had grown tired of de Montfort's ambition, including the powerful Earl of Gloucester. Royalist supporters, desperate for a real leader, flocked to him. The new Edward put his new strategic mind to work. He learned that de Montfort's son was marching to join his father with reinforcements. In a series of brilliant night marches, Edward ambushed the son's army at Kenilworth Castle, completely wiping them out before they could link up. He had learned from his mistakes. Now it was time for revenge. Prince Edward had trapped Simon de Montfort. He had him pinned against a loop of the river Avon near the town of Evesham. On August 4th, 1265, de Montfort looked out from the town and saw an army approaching, flying his son's captured banners. For a brief second, he must have felt a surge of hope. That hope turned to dread when he realized it was Edward's army coming for him. Realizing he was trapped against the river by an army 3 times the size of his own, the old earl reportedly sighed, "Let us commend our souls to God, because our bodies are theirs." What happened next wasn't a battle, it was a massacre. One chronicler even called it the murder of Evesham. For battle, it was none. Edward, using the aggressive tactics he'd learned from de Montfort himself, gave the order for no mercy and no prisoners. His forces smashed into the rebels in a brutal, merciless slaughter. Edward even had a special hit squad of knights whose only job was to find and kill Simon de Montfort. They found him, dragged him from his horse, and cut him down. In an act of shocking brutality, de Montfort's body was horribly mutilated. His head, hands, and feet were hacked off and sent as gruesome trophies of the victory. With that single savage act, the rebellion was annihilated. King Henry III was found unharmed and put back on his throne. But everyone knew the real power had already shifted. The very same prince who had once backed his father's enemies had become the crown's ruthless savior. The Second Barons' War was over. King Henry would reign for another 7 years, but he was a king in name only. The real authority in England now belonged to his son, Prince Edward, that experienced the betrayal, the defeat, the humiliation of captivity, and the bloody taste of vengeance was a brutal education. It turned an impulsive boy into a calculating, strategic, and utterly merciless leader. He had learned a hard lesson. Power, once lost, could only be reclaimed with absolute ferocity. This was the birth of Edward-longshanks, the Hammer of the Scots, the man who would conquer Wales and change the British Isles forever. His chaotic youth hadn't been his ruin. It had been his making.